So this week, we've got four sort of main focuses for the module. We're going to be talking about, change as the only constant. So when we're doing things differently and encouraging others to do things differently, that's persistently challenging. So in all those places where we might snap back to the old way, this reframing asks us to stay in that discomfort of the new. So we've got a little model that will help you consider 5 major domains where people will assess, where people tend to assess whether things are good, bad, comfortable, uncomfortable, where it's risk, where it might be more worth diving in, so that you can consider those as you look at interview process design, both from the perspective of the candidates and also from the hiring committee and those in your organization. Second objective here is around design as a user experience. So what do we want that to look and feel like, again, from all of those perspectives of the candidate, the committee members, and how do we establish rapport and let them know what they can expect in the process? How do we frame the interview? How do we kind of introduce the committee, the candidates, and really kind of set the stage for, productive and curious conversations through those interviews? The third objective here is in crafting questions and scenarios to support KSAs. So we talk about getting alignment with the candidates and understanding the role and the opportunity. We talk a little bit as we go through sketching questions and creating useful scenarios that are based on the KSAs and key concepts of the role. And then finally, we're going to talk a little bit about rubrics for supporting the assessment of each candidate in light of those requirements or those key anchors, KSAs of the role. So we'll run through considering the kinds of rubric that might be useful and how to design those and use them to reflect and to debrief after interview rounds. So that's what we've got in store today.
This is the change initiative, right? We're trying to change, unless you're a brand new organization, you're trying to change the way you do a process in the organization. And there are people who might have built it and think it's great, or don't know why they should change it, or they hold a lot of power and they're not interested in sharing that power and sharing that decision making. And so I thought it might be helpful just to take a moment to say, to recognize that, to highlight that. And this next slide, I'm sure a number of you have seen this. The scarf is these are the things that flip, fight, flight, or freeze switches in people. And I was introduced to this a number of years ago as the organization I was with was going through an office renovation. And it was this thing where I was at a session and the facilitator introduced this, and I'm like, oh my God, this is why I'm in so many meetings about how people are feeling about the office renovation, or I'm in so many meetings about everything but the actual office renovation, that I've sort of kept this with me when thinking about any change initiatives. We see this now amid COVID, right? There's this moment in maybe March 2020 where maybe everyone worked on site, and in April 2020, everyone was virtual. And so the change initiative that just happened, and it's where these 5 switches are when someone's status is threatened. So in a hiring process, I'm the CEO, I get to decide what's going on. I'm sharing power. And so my status as that decision maker is being questioned. And so that might flip a switch. Certainty. This is where change initiatives happen. And you don't feel like you have any, this actually goes into autonomy, but where change initiatives are happening and there's a lot of uncertainty, much like living through a global pandemic, or building a new hiring process. We're building the plane while we're flying it. We're not quite sure where it goes, but this is the opportunity to flip some more switches: autonomy or agency, or feeling like you don't have agency in this. Where it might be happening to you or around you. Relatedness, this is where your relationship to people, maybe Katrina and I, we've always been on the hiring committee. We've been hiring together for 10 years. And now we have other people who are coming in and that changes our relationship to each other. And then fairness, and really the perception of fairness, or perception of equity. And so I always find these are helpful just as a grounding when we say, all right, we're going to introduce this new thing. Do we think it's going to flip any of these switches, so that we can maybe be ready for that in whatever way that comes? And so it's not sort of coming in from the side on a random Tuesday to sort of derail the process. And this next slide, sort of these buckets, my former colleague, Courtney Hars, articulated this when she and I were doing some work together. And I really felt like it was, we think about change, and sometimes it's just like change is this monolithic thing. And Courtney and I were working together, and she said, there's four different buckets. Like, we can change our language, we can change our policies, we can change our practices, and we can change our programs or initiatives. And I always found this so helpful to think, like, what are we actually trying to change here, and how can we align that with what we're trying to do? And in particular, maybe it's not that the organization where like the senior leadership does not want to do anything, but those of us on the hiring committee are like, we need to try and change this organization. So maybe we can change the language without asking permission. Person first language, introducing ourselves with pronouns, don't need permission for that oftentimes. Or changing policies, that maybe we can change the policies, or maybe we can change practices that sort of are directionally correct with where we need to go, that don't require sort of formal approval from the organization. So I just offer these as different buckets for thinking about this work as a change initiative within the organization. And some things, I'll share a piece I don't think I've shared yet, human psychology in the office renovation, that sort of reflects, is a broader look at the various things that involved in change initiatives and things to be aware of. So what's next, Katrina? Designing the interview process. We've made it. Cool. So yeah, I think I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, like creating a process where it's consistent, where it's sort of highly structured, so we compare, apples to apples, versus apples to like trucks or apples to squid. Like, if and having a process that's consistent, that's inclusive, and sort of in a way that's bringing everyone through the process in exactly the same way, so we can compare candidate 1 to candidate 32, rather than what typically happens, or what oftentimes happens, is like bias starts to creep in. And like, we had a really good conversation with this person about bourbon, but again, they're the CFO, and that's not at all related to, unless you actually might be like a bourbon distiller, but that's not at all related to like their ability to the job, the KSAs to do the job. And so really thinking about this highly structured human process. How do we create a process that recognize that it's built on humanity, and recognize it's often stressful for candidates, as one of the things that is often in job processes, and so doing this in a way that's not robotic or bureaucratic, like not a highly structured bureaucratic process, but how is it a humane process, both from the committee side and the candidate side. And so we'll keep coming back to that throughout. And Katrina, I don't know if you have anything else to toss in on this one.
Yeah, I think, like, as a grounding philosophy of moving into the interviews, it's that idea that if we can connect with the committee to understand the importance of that consistency, that impacts things like how we can make the committee available to participate in all of those, in all of the interviews, at least in a particular round, or if there is going to be if there are going to be others, then like, how do we ensure that from the candidate perspective, they're experiencing some consistency in folks, or some, that committee, we're actually thinking about, okay, if somebody in the hiring committee can't be there for one of the interviews of round 1, do we actually ask them to sit out of round 1, or do we actually like make sure that the candidates know that there's somebody else and that person is missing, and we've talked about their absence in this, and this is how we're going to go forward, so that when they show up in the next round, they're known to that person. So this is where you get a little bit bespoke with how we sort of bring this philosophy into these different parts of the interview process.
Yeah, and it's a question that keeps coming up again and again, where it's like, we need X number of people to be involved, the team of 10, and then the leadership, and then it ends up with this process where you've got like 23 people involved in it, and they're all entering in at different points with different knowledge and background of the process and the candidates. And I would say this is like a tension that we often have when we're working with organizations. Like, how do you actually Like what's the core number? And then how do you use all the other processes around this to keep people informed and bring in other voices, especially those who might not be on the sort of formal committee.
Question about discussing who we mean when we say committee. And that's a really good point. I think mod 1, when we talked about, typical ways we approach the search, there was a lot of different things that we heard. We heard, oh, I'm as the HR person, I'm the consistent person in the interview. So I might be in every round, but we might have different people coming in different rounds. And so I'm sort of responsible for bringing that continuity forward. Or, at this point, like I handled the screening and then I sort of handed it off. And so we're really thinking, when we think about committee, we're thinking about who needs to be there. And it's not necessarily about like, I think, Tim, do we have a slide? Am I getting ahead of myself? Do we have a slide that addresses this? I know we talked about it, but.
No, we talked about it in, but no, we don't. We don't have a specific slide. So yeah.
Okay. So we talked about sort of, what is the appropriate size of a hiring committee? I've been in a process once that brought 12 people into my interview. And it was grueling to be in that kind of a situation. So from a candidate perspective, like horrible distribution of power, right? Like just absolutely, like they needed to make sure that the checklist rubric that they were going through, that everybody could check off all the boxes that they could go through. But from my perspective, it was terrible. Yeah, absolutely. And so like we thought like, are there 3 people? Are there 5 people? This is really about like the size of your organization, the capacity that people have to participate in this, because it is a larger use, resource requirements to have more people involved. We tend to say you need somebody that's a decider. If you have sort of a shared leadership model, you might bring another person in. But where we kind of understand that there's some tension is when we sort of fabricate 2 deciders, when really the structure of the organization, that status piece, is that we have 1 decider. And so really talking about kind of from that initial stage, who will make the decision on this hire, and they most likely need to be present throughout this process, because they need to have insight and be able to hear from the other members of the committee how we're assessing candidates and be able to bring that forward. So whether or not that's possible is something that would be kind of, something you need to decide, but also, is there people who that person would work with directly? So people who understand sort of, those KSAs. Are there people on the committee who will be able to identify, what an appropriate answer to a question that speaks to one of those KSAs might be? Are there people that are connected to this person whose work will really intersect? Maybe there's somebody there, right? And so we really want to think about how you're bringing multiple perspectives in that will not be all looking and listening for the same things as you move through the interviews.
This is one of the places where trust is fundamental. Trust is fundamental, I think, in a high-performing, healthy organization. And one of the places where when you don't have trust, there's a lot of tension on like how many and who's on this committee. Like if we have leadership team of 5 people and not all 5 people are on this committee for the hiring of the CEO, because you don't trust that other people are going to represent your interest and that it's going to have this feedback loop, then it's going to break in different places. And I think this is one of those, during hiring, you start to see where things like trust, accountability, alignment, commitments, all this sort of these fundamental things to high performing teams start to become stressed. And those, then it's like, those are other things that you have to address, but they show up and we have to have 30 people in this meeting, because if you're not all in it, or you all have to talk to this candidate for that buy-in piece. And I'm reminded of a couple pieces of research that I found earlier in my career. So they could be a little bit outdated. So grain of salt, I guess, with these, but it was the meeting size starts to decline. So sort of 7 people is like the ideal. This was actually in person, so I'm curious what it would be for virtual, but 7 people is the sort of max point for having people in a meeting, and each additional person, it produces declining returns. And then Google did some work that they published on their rework site around the ideal number of interviews and ideal number of people in interviews. And so granted, this is at Google. I usually like to review the research, but then again, take it with a grain of salt. But they found in their interviews that they did, 4 people was the point for them. And I'll share the actual graphs in the Mighty Network, but 4 people was the number of people that you needed to start. Like each additional person, you didn't gain anything, is like maybe half a percentage point toward clarity. So like 1 person to 2 people was a huge jump. 2 to 3 was another big jump. 3 to 4 started to level off. And then I think it started leveled off at like 85% for every additional person. So from 4 to 30, it was like very minimal change. And that they found 4 interviews was sort of the sweet spot for them. So these organizations will do like 13 people or 30 people over 7 interviews. Google found it was sort of the 4 and 4, which is something that Katrina and I will sort of talk about, how we find 3 to be like, often with also smaller organizations, like these are resources that your space, like where can you get to sort of as much certainty, and then it starts to become, if not declining, diminishing returns for each additional person and step. So as we think about the people who are on the committee, the number of interviews, the number of people in one room, I've always found these helpful as markers just to keep in mind as we're structuring it.
The other thing that connects here, Tim, that we haven't talked about yet is just that bringing back that conversation of transparency. And if you know that everybody can't be a part of the process, and you're trying to figure out, who can we bring into that that discovery kind of space, who can we bring in, or how can we bring people in terms of interview questions, which we'll get there. But it's also about how do we share with the rest of the organization in a transparent way what's happening in this process, so that as we move through, we're actually building that trust and helping people to understand and giving people a space to ask questions or express concern. And how do you work with internal comms channels to figure out how best to kind of share that information?